folks. My name is Nasser Aburahme. I'm the faculty fellow here at the Coworking Center. I just want to begin by welcoming you all to this. This is our third session in the spring semester in our Global Uprising series. Global Uprising is a year-long series. We ran it all of last semester. We'll be running it all of this semester that really revolves around one central question, and that is, how do we rethink collective action from our present, right? So we've taken this idea that the present is somehow defined as this generalized insurgency, right? We're kind of assuming that what defines the present in a certain sense is the frequency, the scale of uprising and protest and dissidence. And the series really is an attempt to try to sort of think that through various analytical entry points. And part of the impetus to kind of put this together came from the uprisings, the anti-racist, anti-police uprisings that happened in this city and in this country in a wider sense last summer, and trying to think of ways to connect that to the 10-year anniversary of the Arab revolts that had just passed, and as well as the kind of renewed wave of uprising in the Middle East and other parts of the world in 2019. Today's event is part of a sort of two-part kind of intervention in the series around broadly speaking questions of space and time. And today's event, which we've called Crowds, Bodies, Affect, really takes a kind of more molecular approach to some of the questions that we've been thinking about. And we've asked our panelists to sort of consider the crowd again, to think through the crowd as an object of thought and as an object of critique, right? And some of the questions we've posed for them is how do we think of the corporality of uprising again today, right? How do we account for the unspoken, the tactile, the affective in uprising today? And how do we think of the crowd? Is the crowd as we used to think of it, this kind of great equalizing event and force, or today does it reproduce and sort of redistribute the uneven distributions of risk and vulnerability? In particular, in the face of what seem to be only increasing regimes of genderizing, racializing, sexualizing difference, how does the crowd relate? How does it upend, but also somehow confirm these differences? These are the kind of broad stakes that our panelists are going to be getting into today. Before I get into format and how we're going to sort of organize the session today, I just want to take a minute to plug our other year-long series, which is called Digital Forays. And it's really a kind of inquiry into what it means to think and act in our digital presence. The next event at the center and the next event in that series is on March 4th. It's about data gathering, changing forms of witness and proof. So I encourage you to check that out. The next event in our Global Uprising series, which, as I said, is a sort of continuation of this sort of broad theme around space and time, is on March 9th. That is called The Square and the Commune. It's a sort of an inquiry into the return of the commune as this sort of mode or moment in uprising. So I encourage you to all stick with us for that. And again, I just want to emphasize this point about both series, that they are, they're cumulative and continuous discussions. So it's really about building on these sort of very closely connected series of interventions. I want to also just very quickly thank our colleagues at the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality here at NYU, as well as the Duke UNC Consortium for Middle East Studies, for their generous co-support. We were very grateful for their support. So in terms of format, sadly, Jasbir Puar is unable to be with us today, and we miss her, but the upshot of that is that each of our panelists is going to have a little bit more time to stage their intervention. So each of our two panelists will go for about 12 to 15 minutes and just set out a kind of intervention that responds to the prompts, that lays out the stakes as they see it. And then we will turn to our discussant for a mediated 30-minute discussion between the panelists. After that, as is usual, we open it to Q&A. Everyone is invited to pitch in, to ask a question. We encourage you to use the chat function to ask questions. You can do that at any time. If something comes to you, you don't have to wait for the Q&A section to ask that question. Pose it any time, and we will relay it to the panelists. You can also, if you want to verbally pose a question, once we get to the Q&A section, use the raise hand function. we'll call on you and you can pose your question that way. I should also mention that these events are recorded. They'll be up on our YouTube page in due course. The sort of formal proceedings will end at 2 on the hour. But we do tend to linger around a little bit to give people a chance just to sort of debrief, pose a few more questions if our panelists have time, just so that's not a totally abrupt kind of exit and closure. So our speakers today, which we are very grateful to have with us, are really at the kind of cutting edge of these questions in a lot of ways. And I think the tremendous numbers that have registered for this event are really testament to the importance of their work. So we're really very grateful to have them with us. And I'm going to introduce them very briefly in alphabetical order and in the order of their appearance. And then I'm just going to turn it over. Nadia Al-Ali is the director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Brown University, where she's also Robert Family Professor of International Studies and Professor of Anthropology and Middle East Studies. She's the author of a number of books, and her latest publication is the co-edited book entitled Gender, Governance, and Islam. Frances Hasso is an associate professor in the program in Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Duke, with secondary appointments in the Department of History and Department of Sociology. She too is the author of many books and a recently co-edited volume, Freedom Without Permission, Bodies in Space in the Arab Revolutions. Our discussant today, our very own Gayatri Gopinath, is professor and director of the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality here at NYU, and she's the author of the book, Impossible Desires, Queer Diasporas and South Asian Public Cultures. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Nadia, and thank our panelists once again for being with us.
Thank you very much, Nasser, and thank you. I'm very happy to be in conversation with you today. So, yeah, I will start. Crowds, in my view, are precarious. They simultaneously offer new and radical embodied sociabilities and political imaginings, while also holding the potential for reinforcing inequalities, forms of marginalization, and vulnerabilities. At some point in our lives, many of us have experienced a sense of losing ourselves into a sea of bodies. I mean, I know it's a bit of a cliche, you know, whether in a music concert, a rave, or political protest. And I'm aware that these are not the same. We are overpowered by emotion, ecstasy even. I remember one major spiritual experience in my life, losing myself into a crowd during a Sufi ritual in Omdurman in the Sudan about 15 years ago. I never forget how my body seemed to be taken over by the rhythm and the movement of bodies next to me, moving to the drums, chanting, and feeling one with the crowd, even with the universe. I remember feeling astonished that gender did not seem to matter, as man and woman were moving equally to the sounds of the drums, resonating with each other. Although I should say that the whirling dervishes in the middle of the gigantic circle that the crowd was forming, they were all male. I felt really safe as I was experiencing this almost mystical moment. Now, that experience stood in harsh contrast to another Sufi event I experienced in Cairo a few years later. I went to the annual Moulid al-Nabi celebrations to mark the birthday of the Prophet near the Al-Hussein Mosque in Old Cairo. And I think, although I was dressed mostly, I mean, in very sort of modest dress, and I think I can, you know, pass as an Egyptian, I have to say, I mean, it was a terrible experience. And I mean, it means that Egyptian women experience this as well. While the crowd was getting more intense, I got separated from my friends and I found myself surrounded by men who were pressing themselves against me and touching different parts of my body until I panicked, and I did luckily manage to escape. I mean, forgive me for this, what might sound like a slight diversion and possibly uncomfortable diversion. I'm quite aware that the crowds we are thinking of today are about the uprisings that we've seen unfolding over the past years and beyond before. Crowds engaging in political protest might be distinct from those linked to religious and spiritual events. Yet I want to say that as a woman and as a feminist scholar and activist, I find it difficult to think of any crowd without thinking of the potential gendered vulnerabilities and gendered violations. And here I should also profess another bias here, a different one. I grew up in Germany to fear crowds and their fascist potential. My education was geared towards equating crowds with political intoxication and mass manipulation. Meanwhile, I was also conscious that my relatives in Iraq frequently had to show up to orchestrated PR mass mobilizations to prove their loyalty to the leader, Saddam Hussein. I remember getting into an argument with the British MP, George Galloway. Some of you might remember George Galloway, the famous, who in 1991 took a red London double-decker bus all the way to Baghdad to raise consciousness about the devastating effect of depleted uranium used in the 1991 war on the Iraqi population. And I was in a meeting with Galloway, and he was proudly talking about the crowd of people gathering to welcome him and the others on the bus. And he seemed to be totally oblivious to the fact that there were no spontaneous mass gatherings in Baghdad at the time. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I had to revise my perception of crowds, and nowadays feel much more ambivalent than I used to. And similar to most of my friends and colleagues around the world, I was, of course, I have been filled with excitement and hope as the images, video clips, messages, and analysis of the earlier uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt were coming in. And more recently, I felt incredibly inspired and moved by the uprisings in the Sudan, Lebanon, and Iraq. And of course, in between, the many other mass protests in countries in the region that we've seen since the beginning of the uprisings and even before that. So as much as I'm troubled, though, by what I perceive to be romanticized notions of crowds, I do recognize the effective and political power as forces for progressive politics that aim to transform societies and states into more equal and just entities. I assume, like many of you listening to me today, I have felt a sense of being swept away with the tide of possibilities and hopefulness in the early days of the uprisings. Yet I also remember feeling skeptical and anxious when my Egyptian feminist friends were telling me that any gender differences were totally suspended in their collective protest. They were participating as Egyptian citizens, not as women, and so they were not making gender-based claims. I mean, I did not say much at the time. Who was I to say anything? I was sitting in a office, in London, and I wasn't going to point to the long history of women being sidelined during or in the aftermath of revolutionary moments, but I was thinking it. I mean, we know that over and over again, historically and cross-culturally, mass protests and uprisings have opened up spaces for women whose bodies were temporarily accepted into the wider body politic by and large male and heteronormative, only to be told over and over again when the crowns started to disperse or to transform that their bodies needed to be protected, shielded away from inappropriate spaces and interactions. Their bodies needed to be controlled and returned to their rightful places. So over the past few years, I've been thinking a lot about the significance of body politics, both in the various attempts to challenge political authoritarianism and in the violent backlashes against anti-authoritarian political mobilizations and gendered claims. Body politics is often used in relation to the mobilization and activism around bodily integrity and challenges to heteronormativity. However, it also refers to the practices and policies through which powers of society and state regulate the human body. It is based on the recognition that bodies are at the core of families, economies, and social and political institutions. Also, I would like to stress that the centrality of body politics is not only articulated through the bodies of women, although that is most often the case, but also through the bodies of men and more specifically men's sexualities, as well as the bodies of LGBTQ people. And we've seen this, over and over again in terms of the targeting of gay men or non-binary and transgender people. Heteronormativity has been central to militarism and authoritarianism and is very much part of the backlash against the radical social and political transformation. And at this point, I just want to insert a footnote here. I mean, the crowd has been referred to as the Arab street in earlier reports and media discourses, but I've also seen some of my academic colleagues use this term initially anyway. And personally, I found the term extremely problematic. Although street politics is clearly very important, the term seems to imply a level of homogeneity that glosses over differences. And here I'm not only thinking class and gender, but it is also political differences and nuances and complexities that get lost in a term like that. And crucially, in my view, it is actually time, and I recognize that I might make myself very unpopular saying that among some people, but I think it is time to challenge the all-encompassing label Arab that glosses over the fact that there are many non-ethnic Arab minorities living across the region. In 2011 in Iraq, it was mainly Kurds in the north and Suleimania who were on the street protesting, and they were not very impressed by the term, the Arab Spring. And everywhere in the Arab majority countries, and everywhere in Arab majority countries, we have ethnic minorities who are experiencing various degrees of discrimination and marginalization, depending on context, and are frequently further marginalized by our narratives. Moreover, I think that there are clear parallels to protest movements and uprisings in both Iran and Turkey. I'm thinking specifically of the Green Movement after the 2009 presidential elections in Iran and the Gezi protest in the summer of 2013 in Turkey. Now, if we look at specific crowds in and across the region, but even within one country, I would say that we need to add temporality to the equation. Crowds may transform over time, as the women in Cairo protesting on International Women's Day on 8th of March 2011 found out. While they had experienced the suspension of gender-based differences during the 18 days of protest on Tahrir Square that ended in the ousting of Mubarak only a few weeks later, when they were there to celebrate and mark the call for women's rights and gender-based equality, they were accosted and insulted by men who asked them to go home and engage in their proper roles. And in the ongoing history of the uprisings in the region, crowds have been both equalizing, whether with respect to gender, class, generation, as well as religious and political affiliations, while also having been deeply divisive. So there have been a range of different political moments having given rise to different political motivations and aims for mobilization. As I already mentioned Egypt a few times, the most obvious example for divisive crowds in the recent history is the mobilization for and against the Muslim Brotherhood following the ousting of Mubarak, culminating in the Rabaa massacre that in turn polarized those previously belonging to one crowd even further. And crowds might be divisive, not merely because authoritarian regimes might have mobilized some people and created crowds for their interests. Crowds, even if inclusive and acting in resonance, frequently are boundary-making mechanisms in which those not joining a multitude of bodies might transform into the other in different registers. As much as ecstasy and the sense of security, a sense of courage and bravery, while belonging to a wider whole, are effective characteristics of crowds, so is fear. Fear to not belong, fear to stand out, fear to be seen as the other, fear of violence, particularly gendered violence. According to Sarah Ahmed, fear works to contain some bodies in a way that they take up less space. Fear might work to restrict some bodies through the movement or expansion of others. And since the beginning of the pandemic that we have been experiencing now for over a year, crowds clearly carry new risks and new fears. So I'm equally troubled by the romanticization of crowds as I'm by elitist and liberal ideas of mob behavior, particularly when it comes to Middle Eastern men who are often represented as sex-craved criminal thugs or terrorists. I'm not going to rehearse the excellent arguments made by my colleagues Paul Amar, Salwa Ismail, or Farha Ghanem in relation to prevailing constructions and representations of urban poor masculinities, particularly with reference to Egypt. We are all aware of stereotypical depictions of young poor men, not only in Western media and policy context, but also within and amongst people in the region who, by virtue of their privileged class background, but also other differences, often generational biases, might portray and view young urban men as a risk and danger, and crucially as a homogeneous entity. We know it is easy to homogenize certain groups of men to so-called baltaria, thugs, involved in various forms of violence, including the harassment of women. Yet this myopic view of violence glosses over the political economy and the many connecting threads we need to look at, while also recognizing that young, poor men do not automatically make up a homogeneous crowd. The recourse to gender-based violence or the condoning of violence might point not to the routine functioning of patriarchy or the resurgence of traditionalism, but to its threatened demise at a point when notions of female subordination and heteronormativity are no longer securely hegemonic. And Denise Caniotti has made the point several times over the past years that we cannot simply explain away the targeting of women's dress codes, their mobility, their sexuality, their presence during protest, and the fact that they are political actors as manifestations of patriarchy and misogyny. She argues that patriarchy no longer functions as usual and requires a higher level of coercion and the deployment of more varied ideological state apparatuses. And so she speaks of this masculinist restoration. So in the interest of time, I'm going to conclude to say that I would say that I view crowds similar to the way I view social media. They can be a medium for collective, inclusive mobilization to challenge repression, inequalities, authoritarianism, and so on, creating a bigger whole than its parts, and the sense of strength, security, and belonging. But they can also be used to support the status quo or be a medium to sideline and marginalize further, creating not only divisions, but also fear, vulnerabilities, and different forms of violence. The fact that physical crowds, as opposed to online ones, are embodied, physically embodied, is clearly significant. Yet we also know that the clear distinction between the two is problematic in the context of the uprisings and many political struggles around the world, as people tend to engage in both simultaneously, at least before COVID-19. So I realized that I've been articulating my ambivalence here more than any firm ideas. And I should say, I mean, not only do I feel ambivalent, but I would also say that I find it impossible to answer any question about crowds, the effects they hold and evoke, and the politics and political consequences they pursue and create in the abstract. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. Francis, over to you.
I just want to say that Nadia and I did not coordinate. I want to greet everybody, friends and colleagues and others in the audience. And I want to thank Jared and Jim and Nasser and others who worked and are working behind the scenes to make this event and the series happen. I've watched a few of the events on YouTube. And I want to thank the NYU Kevorkian Center and the additional sponsors, including Duke and UNC. I've just completed a book manuscript on a completely different topic. So what I did is I prepared for today's panel by rereading and reconsidering work I authored or co-authored in the past few years on the Arab revolutions and their aftermaths. That work has been substantially oriented to the themes of corporeality and what I think of as the scenes of political conflict and revolt, the spaces where bodies, voices, ideologies, organizations, and affects come together or collide to make or remake the world. In the introduction to Freedom Without Permission, Bodies in Space in the Arab Revolutions, which I wrote with Zakiya Salim, we make a number of overall points, a few of which I'll foreground here. We argue that in contrast to classic social science treatments, revolution broadly captures and captured the affective, intimate, embodied, institutional, and spatial registers of upheaval and transgression in the revolts and revolutions. Activists and researchers may well ask to what degree these upheavals and transgressions have continued or outlasted 2011. How have other events and dynamics, including state repression, war, and captured media, reshaped, crushed, or redirected them? We borrowed the phrase freedom without permission from Lemia bin Youssef's research on revolutionary Tunisia to recognize that while freedom is an unstable sign loaded with the ideological freight of its linguistic context, that does not make it, quote, a sham or an illusion, unquote, in Nicholas Rose's terms. Used by activists then and now, it often opens up emancipatory politics of life that refuse the Orientalist dichotomization between individual and collective desires and recognizes interdependencies and relationalities. Nevertheless, the revolutions and uprisings from the very beginning generated both emancipatory and repressive possibilities. We focused on the centrality of embodiment and spatiality in the revolutions, or more specifically, how they challenge the organization and partition of bodies in relation to spaces, as well as the meanings, physical compositions, and feelings in the scenes of politics. Spatial strategies were central to the Arab revolutions and uprisings, which were often oriented toward flat or non-hierarchical democratic organization and decision-making, even if they were often not successful, as was the case with the Occupy movements that followed. All spaces are structured by ideological assumptions and experienced situationally and interpreted subjectively. They carry their histories and potentialities. All of us feel this in our bones, nerves, and skins, I should say, as we traverse different spaces. We know that bodies and voices out of order and out of place threaten power. Khalid Fahmy called the Egyptian revolution a revolution of the body. Our fleshy bodies are who we are and the locations from which ideas are produced, affects are felt, and relations are made. It matters when they are penetrated, crushed, impoverished, malnourished, unhoused, or injured. The bodies and voices that cross lines of control, constituted as impermeable, were central to anxieties, exhilaration, and even panic within all the revolutions, as indicated by infection, invasion, and contamination metaphors. One of the most politically evocative and powerful counter-revolutionary spatial metaphors of the Arab revolutions framed the order offered by repressive systems against chaos. We continue to underestimate the psychic power of such framing, since few can function in permanent chaos. In Civil and the Limits of Politics in Revolutionary Egypt, which is an article, I highlight the problem of substantial proportions of the masses who prefer military, police, or authoritarian rule. Many Copts, feminists, and queers in Egypt were neutral on whether a civil legal order was established under an autocratic leftist or liberal rule, to some degree because they understood Islamic and Coptic options as worse in their sexual and sectarian rules. And if order versus chaos are the only options offered, many prefer military rule as a stabilizing lesser of two evils, quote unquote. This desire for police is not only in Egypt and not only in the Arab world. We have to recognize where a lot of us are situated right now, which is the United States. The crisis must always be policed, to use Stuart Hall's still resonant and relevant framing. Sadim and I write that, quote, the violent outcomes of many of these revolts tempered assumptions that even radical and massive ruptures in public squares and streets can easily overturn or erase historical patterns of repression, inequality, and ideological disagreement, including in everyday embodied relations. Such sticky divisions often become bases to reconsolidate lines of control, unquote. We argue that ideological conflict, sexual difference, and class inequality, which are embodied and inscribed into institutions, spaces, and subjectivities, are not easily overcome by mass protest. We focus on what feminist geographers Liz Bondi and Joyce Davidson, among others, term the sticky and embodied aspects of difference and inequality that limit the horizons of the inclusive pluralities that emerged in these revolutions and uprisings initially. Bondi and Davidson write that identities and places are not, quote, freely chosen or easily transformed. Instead, the dynamic interplay between space, place, and sexualized embodiments is subject to inertia and stickiness, unquote. These obdurate subordinations, we write, Sadim and I, were connected to particular bodies, spaces, and times. We should not be surprised that they persistently emerge in every scene of politics, particularly so when the politics are oriented to radical democracy, inclusion, and non-hierarchy. Drawing on Bondi and Davidson, we write, quote, it follows that although spaces and places that reproduce dominance can be breached by subversive actions, the effects of such breaches are uncertain and contestable, unquote. Thus, policing spaces quickly became essential in responses to the uprisings and revolutions, usually by state forces, but by other social formations as well. So, three of the stickiest problems that continue to powerfully shape life here, there, and everywhere are the class-based maldistributions of resources and power, the dominance of militarism and policing to manage the never-ending crises of racial capitalism and imperialism, and that politicians and their policing arms in these systems are solely accountable to the moneyed and propertied classes. These realities are not so quickly transformed. Powerful sources of crushing repression come down and came down on viable threats to established economic and political orders in Arab countries, the US, and elsewhere. This repression is often racialized and reinforced by immigration and citizenship laws. The Arab revolutions occurred in places with deep and long evidence of masculine privilege in access to and free mobility in urban spaces. These privileges, however, are always tentative, relational, and easily lost in battles involving differently situated boys and men. We must recognize this radical plurality. In my article, Masculine Love and Sensuous Reason, the Affective and Spatial Politics of Egyptian Ultras Football Fans, I argue that feminist critiques of the ultras based on their male homosociality limits our understanding of the sensuous embodied masculine fun they cultivated, which the ruling class quickly moved to violently repress. The ultras, I argue, challenge gendered rationality, affect, and mind-body binaries as they enacted love and outrage together with wide-ranging effects in Egypt. Their politics of emancipatory rupture was informed by concrete experiences as they battled for space in militarized Egypt. Subjectivities and spaces are somewhat transformed through these intense experiences, depending on the person, context, and intensity, but we don't know the long-term implications, how such experiences will be lodged in individual and collective memory and body, and how or whether they will reemerge and in what forms. The ultras insisted in their iconography and performances that they cultivate what they called methods of life, forms of protest that exceed existing ideological, institutional, and spatial boundaries. I argue this method also challenged the dulling of eros and enclosures by capitalism and militarism. In a chapter that I wrote called The Sex, Police Nexus and Politics in Bahrain's Pearl Revolution, I argue that sex and sect boundaries increasingly interarticulated in these revolutions or worked through each other. These interarticulations paradoxically shifted gender norms and embodiments in Bahrain's public spaces as dramatically as had the 1979 Iranian Revolution, challenging state sex-based shaming strategies motivated by policing impulses. Gender and sexuality are foundational to sectarianism, a racializing dynamic used to police and control. I draw on Rancière's sense of police's desire to sustain the sensible by repressing embodied breaches of authorized place, time, relations, and space. What I term sectarian formation shows how sex, sect, and citizenship status become resources for categorical boundary making in Bahrain and elsewhere in the Arab world. Scholarship on sectarianism in the Middle East, in contrast, generally avoids the centrality of sex and gender to the reproduction and policing of religious and ethnic boundaries. In Bahrain, sect and sex were frequently co-articulated to cast aspersions on the reputations of activists, making suspicious the non-marital and polymorphous relationships of consenting adults, and increasing family pressure on especially women activists to avoid the appearance of impropriety. In Egypt, sex and sect interarticulated differently, but were and are no less destructive. Sex and sect interarticulate in built environments, discourse, digital space, law, and desire. In Civil and the Limits of Politics in Revolutionary Egypt, I show how the Egyptian state remains, in the Egyptian context, the most significant actor in partitioning the sensible, making and guarding lines of exclusion and minoritization, deciding what may not be said or heard, and punishing transgression. But policing sensibilities, ideological differences, and positional inequalities are also brought into the scenes of collective politics by activists themselves. Masculinist policing of women was enacted by left, liberal, Islamist, and militarist formations. State-sponsored actors are not the only sources of the dirty work of gendered and sexual violence that partitions space and limits the horizons of emancipatory politics. I show that ideological, embodied, and positional differences are rarely overcome in more than ephemeral ways, challenging Rancièrean notions of politics, or at least speaking back to them. While there are always emergent possibilities for new forms and new politics, bodies enter the scene already constituted and subjectified, which shapes their experiences and their actions. And I have lots of other things to say, but I will, I'm alert to time, and I'd rather have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Frances. I'm going to turn it over to Gayatri now, who's going to pose a few questions and kindly facilitate a discussion. I just want to quickly remind folks in the audience that you can pose questions anytime in the chat, so you don't have to wait to the Q&A. Gayatri?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. And we at the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality at NYU are very happy to be co-sponsoring this event. And I also want to just congratulate all of you at the Kevorkian Center for just remarkable programming over the year. So I'm really happy to be part of it. So Nadia and Frances, those were incredibly rich and illuminating a set of comments. So I'm just going to sort of say a few words by way of sort of opening up a conversation between the two of you. One of the things that struck me it was the image that you folks at the Kevorkian Center used to advertise this event. And it was an image of a woman in 1988 in Beit Sahor in Palestine, right? And she's holding her pair of stilettos, a yellow pair of stilettos in one hand. She has a yellow scarf and she looks like she's in motion, perhaps throwing something, and she has these bare feet. And I'd love to hear you all talk about why you chose that image. But to me, that was just a really wonderful image to use to talk about this set of issues, because it seems to me that, you know, she's taking off her stilettos in order to perhaps run more easily, right? To have some more mobility. But of course, it's her bare feet that are on the ground. And so to me, it makes clear how, you know, there are certain bodies that are always vulnerable, that are always at risk, that there's no way for her to actually mitigate the risk to her body. And I think that goes along with, you know, really the question that both Frances and Nadia are posing, which is, you know, how the corporeality actually doesn't dissolve, right? That the kind of materiality of the sex body, the gendered body, the racialized body is actually very much present, if not heightened, in the space of the crowd. And I thought Nadia did such a beautiful job of really pointing, and both of you actually did such a beautiful job of really pointing to that contradiction of the ways in which the crowd, on the one hand, the kind of paradox and contradiction of the crowd, right? And both of you were pointing this out, that on the one hand, it can have both emancipatory and repressive possibilities simultaneously. And that in relation to, you know, bodily vulnerability, I thought, Nadia, you know, the way in which you juxtapose the two different Sufi celebrations was actually really brilliant, because it's precisely about how, you know, that temporary moment of the erasure of difference is precisely that, it's temporary, and then it can get reasserted in this other context very easily. So I think you're both pointing to the ways in which there is no fixed or stable meaning to the crowd and what happens to bodies within the crowd. And I just wanted to, you know, again, sort of by way of opening up these conversations, I wanted to bring in another voice, which is that of Saidiya Hartman. And I just want to share a quote from you. Let me see if I can share my screen. Hold on one second. Okay. Am I sharing my screen? Okay, perfect. So, you know, so this is a quote from Saidiya Hartman from her book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. And, you know, I turned to this because I started thinking about, you know, what's the difference between the crowd and the mob? You know, especially when we think of something like the Capitol riots on January 6th. How do we understand the difference between the crowd and the mob? And, you know, the prompt, you know, you all at the Kevorkian Center wrote, bodies acting together in risk is transformative. And I thought, you know, when is it transformative? What kind of transformation? Which bodies are at risk, which aren't, when, right? And this, I think both Nadia and Frances are really pointing to the contingency of those questions of risk and vulnerability and transformation. You know, it struck me just thinking about January 6th for a second that one of the things that some of those participants in the riot said is that they were actually shocked that they were pepper sprayed, right? They just couldn't imagine that the state would turn against them. And so they never thought of themselves at risk, right? And so I think that's also a question, you know, which bodies even imagine themselves at risk and which cannot even imagine themselves at risk. So, you know, thinking about the difference between the mob and the crowd, you know, I think Saidiya Hartman's book sort of answers that in some ways with her notion of the chorus. And so, she's talking about the chorus as a way to talk about the kinds of everyday practices of freedom enacted by young Black women in the early 20th century in New York and Philadelphia. And so she uses the chorus, the notion of them working as a chorus, to talk about how they function within the space of racial enclosure. And so I just wanted to read this, this quote. So she writes, "The Greek etymology of the word chorus refers to dance within an enclosure. What better articulates the long history of struggle, the ceaseless practice of Black radicalism and refusal, the tumult and upheaval of open rebellion, than the acts of collaboration and improvisation that unfold within the space of enclosure? The chorus is the vehicle for another kind of story, not of the great man or tragic hero, but one in which all modalities play a part, where the headless group incites change, where mutual aid provides a resource for collective action, not leader and mass, where the untranslatable songs and seeming nonsense make good the promise of revolution. The chorus propels transformation. It is an incubator of possibility, an assembly sustaining dreams of the otherwise." So for her, the chorus, right, the sense of a collective is about working within a space of enclosure, right, towards a possibility of collective freedom. And she actually then ends her book with this image of a starling murmuration. And of course, starlings, they function in formation, right, without actually having a leader, right? They move in tandem, they know which way to go without there being a leader. And so, I think that then can be an answer to, what's the difference between the crowd and the mob? The crowd is working within the space of enclosure in order to transform it, in order to sort of undo those hierarchies of social difference rather than to uphold them. So let me just unshare my screen. So I think I bring that up in order to just have us think more about precisely the kinds of contradictions that you're both laying out around the ways in which the crowd can function, both as I think Nadia said, as this kind of boundary making mechanism that upholds hierarchies, as opposed to one that seeks to undo it. So maybe we can just start there with like getting to, precisely this kind of contradiction that you both lay out. And, what determines, right, the moments where the crowd is not the mob, right? Because with Nadia, when you were describing that celebration, the second celebration, where the ecstasy of the crowd actually then transforms into the mob, enacting a kind of violence on you. So what accounts for that transformation? And how do we theorize that sort of malleability of the crowd? So this is just an invitation to sort of expand on some of the issues that you brought up already.
Shall I have a first go? Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Gayatri, and also Francis. I really enjoyed your intervention. I mean, I should profess, as I did to my ambivalence, that there are lots of bits of the puzzle that I don't understand. And I think that there is something about it that goes beyond comprehension. And maybe I also think that it really needs a collective interdisciplinary effort, because I think, so I'm an anthropologist. I do think that it needs economists, it needs sociologists, historians, cultural studies, psychologists to actually put together this puzzle. I guess what I, from my sort of limited perspective, understand is that, and I guess I was sort of trying to stress that in terms of, crowds do exist in specific historical moments and specific political economies and empirical context. And so there is a whole, we know, I mean, so many of us have kind of pointed out, you know, the uprisings in the region didn't just emerge out of nowhere. You know, there are long histories of political struggles that predated them in any given country and also more collectively. And so the kinds of specific political struggles that predated the uprisings, I would say, shape the kinds of crowds we've seen, right? And for me, really, the temporality bit is very important, because I think I'm more hesitant to make a sort of clear distinction between the crowd and the mob. I see that it's sort of much more fluid, and that there is this potential from one, I mean, you said that as well, Gayatri, towards the end, that, you know, from one to move from one to the other. And so what are the specifics that transform this? I mean, clearly there is sort of this sense, I mean, I think sort of the easiest way to speak about it is, you know, as long as there's this one clear political message that unifies everyone, you know, that sort of seems to supersede, you know, the differences, although, you know, we know that that's not quite true, but, you know, there is sort of this sense, and I think that can carry over for hours, days, you know, even weeks, the sense of, you know, one big purpose. But we know that, you know, in any political struggles, you know, people will take different positions. They will take different positions based on the different identities, positionalities, pre-existing inequalities. And the moment those differences emerge, I think, you know, tensions start to come up. And then, you know, the question is again, you know, so what are the differences? What are the tensions? So, I mean, I've described a number of tensions and differences and vulnerabilities linked to gender and sexuality. But, you know, I've also referred to, you know, political differences, you know, in the Egyptian context, you know, it was one crowd against Mubarak, but then we saw, you know, incredible polarization and also violence against each other when it came to the, you know, Muslim Brotherhood. So, but I mean, I still don't understand, having experienced some of the gender-based violence and everyday forms of harassment when I was living in Cairo. I find it amazing and not quite understandable how it was possible to have these 18 days where, I mean, everyone who was there was speaking about the sort of suspension of gender-based differences and all kinds of differences. Although when you dig, you know, some people were saying that, okay, there were problems in the side streets. But yeah, I mean, there is an element that I don't understand, both in terms of that it is possible for a moment to suspend and to create this equalizing space, but also, you know, the switches. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
So did you want me to?
Yes, please.
Yes. So I'll offer some of my fragmented thoughts from research and also from experience, because I've actually organized not crowds, but mobilized people for demonstrations. I myself have been involved in occupations or decolonizations, you know, from when I was pretty young. And so I think two things that Nadia mentioned are very important, which is there are just all these organizational and ideological dynamics that pre-exist any gathering, demonstration, crowd, mob. There always are. There are all these other people who show up, and then, you know, the level of organization and the dynamics and the preparation really of the mobilizers really matters to where that goes. I think it's almost inevitable that there are tensions. And my understanding of the first 18 days in Cairo is there were tensions. My understanding is the early period, and I'm sure this is true in multiple places, of the occupation of the Pearl Roundabout in Manama, Bahrain, there were tensions, but then people also had commitments to kind of resolve them, and they were able to do that. And we should never underestimate, the power actually of agents provocateurs, state violence, things like that. So the sticky dynamics will always be there, including class dynamics, that whenever you have something in the streets, you are going to, it is open, you're going to be dealing with different kinds of people. You are no longer in your meeting spaces. And so I wanted to say that, and then going to Hartman, the everyday practices of freedom within spaces of racial enclosure. I mean, that's one thing that feminist scholarship has been better at, is thinking about the everyday, the ways in which the everyday intersects with politics. And we know that in Middle East studies, we have a kind of dichotomization where, like, the culture work kind of stuff, the gender, the relationalities, that granular ways of everyday life that that has a lower status, I would argue, than the kind of macro focus. And it's rare actually to have a multi-scalar kinds of analyses. So when I was reading and listening to you, so I thought about these early 20th century African American women in New York and Philadelphia. So that and also I just recently taught Angela Davis's Blues Women in an undergraduate class. Ma Rainey, Bessie Davis, same time period. In the South, though, they're kind of thinking and doing and mobilizing all together, right? There isn't like this kind of dichotomization of thinking and doing, or a dichotomization of like everyday life and politics with a capital P. And then they're also making spaces of joy and sex and self-fulfillment and integrity and creativity. And I think you have to assume that that's always sort of happening under different kinds of conditions. And there's a way that the crowd or the mobilization or the demonstration, it's a rupture, but I think we don't want to, give it more, it's significant. I don't want to say it's not significant, especially in places where people fear gathering. But I think we could hyperbolize it in a way that misses all the other kinds of things that happened before, that are going on during, and that also follow. I also just wanted to just add that I'm right now active in political movements in North Carolina. This is like a kind of COVID development of dealing and working on a project on death. And then we're living in unfair distributions of death and illness. And one thing that's, one thing that I've kind of been reminded of is actually the importance of continuously organizing and making spaces where people are kind of thinking, doing, and acting, that it, kind of to avoid the romanticization of the moments of, say, heat, the dramatic scenes of protest, because a lot goes into them and actually they cannot be sustained. So if you just think about it, they cannot be sustained because somebody has to take care of the elderly, somebody has to change the baby's diapers, somebody has to go earn a living, go to the market, clean the house, and things like that. So I've always had a kind of, I think they're important, they're exciting, they do something, but they're also, they have their limits.
Nasser, can I ask one more thing, or do we want to go to, okay. So first of all, thank you both for your thoughts. I just had a few thoughts in response. Francis, that's exactly why I wanted to bring this idea Hartman into the mix, because I think you're exactly right. There's a way in which we fetishize particular forms of mass mobilization and mass protest and efface the kinds of everyday ways in which resistance operates. And so to me, you know, what Hartman allows us to think about is, can we understand the crowd not simply as mass protest on the street, right? Can we understand the crowd more like the chorus, right? As kind of collective action happening in other sites that may not be readily visible to us. And of course, you know, that's often the way in which gendered forms of subterfuge, repudiation, refusal operate. So I really appreciated, you know, your gloss there on that. The question I had for both of you, picking up on what you all said, is, you know, what happens to, you know, that momentary, the kinds of affects that the crowd engenders, right? So Nadia, you talked about fear, right? Francis, you talked about, both of you talked about ecstasy. Francis, you talked about love, outrage in relation to the ultras, right? So what happens to those forms of affect that are produced and mobilized in the space of the crowd? Can they be, are they simply this momentary thing? You both talked about the temporality of the crowd, right? The momentary nature of it. Can they be mobilized after? Do they have a life? How, you know, what form do those momentary affects take after the crowd has dispersed? Any thoughts on that? Nadia, would you like to begin?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I would strongly think that they have afterlives, and that they different affective registers transform, again, depending on context. So I mentioned harassment and gender-based violence and the fear that is linked to that. And I think that fear lingers, and it's a continuous threat. It predates, again, any kind of immersion into a crowd. I mean, certainly for women, non-binary, LGBTQ people, I mean, there is that fear, the constant fear. But what do we do with it? And I would say that we've seen in many contexts, I'm thinking particularly Egypt, because I've mentioned Egypt several times, is that there was a real transformation in the sense that the protest opened up spaces, and gender-based women and LGBTQ people, but I would say probably more women, were able to mobilize around their fears and around the violence and actually collectivize. And crucially, and this is why, you know, also one way to challenge this idea of the young urban male mob, you know, they were actually joined by many young men who did for the first time recognize that, you know, gender-based violence is not just a side issue in their overall vision for a new and just society. And so we've seen, you know, women actually starting to talk about their experiences. And when we think about Samira Ibrahim, who actually challenged the military after she had experienced a virginity test, it wasn't the first time that women in Egypt had to, you know, experience this horrendous assault, but this political moment somehow allowed a space for her to come out. I mean, you know, there were not many women like her, but she opened up the space. And I would say that the combination of the collectivizing of fear, the finding each other, the resonance, well, you know, I've experienced something similar, plus the radical political moment did allow many women to then actually act and organize, mobilize. And we know that there are many organizations in Egypt who have been focusing on this. So that's just one feeling. I mean, ecstasy, I think that unfortunately in many contexts, particularly you know, in places like Egypt, where we've just gone to, you know, very different, very repressive contexts again. Unfortunately, I think that what we've seen now is sort of a mass traumatized and depression, right? But there are lots of different stages in between. But maybe Francis will speak more about ecstasy.
Yeah, no, not ecstasy, not now. But I do think that I mean, we've talked about how temporality matters. And from previous work I've done on Palestine, I actually know that intensity matters. So, and organization matters. So, an intense experience, whether it's fear or ecstasy or love, like in the context of a demonstration or a crowd or being penetrated by a police officer, can actually produce a range of responses. And I do think the collective production of different kinds of explanations really matters, and to where that goes. Now, I think if I remember with Samira Ibrahim, her father was very important in her. I'm not so sure the secular feminist organizations would have been that good for Samira Ibrahim. Just knowing the terrain, you know, in Cairo in that way. I mean, and it's a very complicated terrain. But from what I understand, her father, who was pretty pious, I don't remember his ideological. He might have been Ikhwan. He was very important to her ability and willingness to go forward. So when I think about your question, Gayatri, I also just think about other settings and longer studies on political socialization, and which is that actually it can make a massive difference depending on the individuals involved, you know, who they define themselves against and what kind of explanations are out there to help them deal with those kinds of questions. And people can go in multiple directions, including more reactionary. I also think that the feminist scholarship shows us the importance of intergenerational, because there are times when all peoples must recede and retreat, you know, and but those spaces of retreat are not apolitical, you know, and so I was just thinking about one of the things I learned in the fall when I read Keisha Blaine's book Set the World on Fire, is that Malcolm X was in prison in the 1950s for, I don't know, stealing a car part. But I also learned that his mother was really, really active in the Marcus Garvey movement, right? And so that's just interesting, you know, to think about, right? And so anyway, so I do think that the responses will diffract, let's say, if I were to use a term that is used in feminist philosophy, feminist physics, that they might diffract. Thanks.
Thank you both so much. I know there's a ton of really fascinating comments in the chat, so maybe I'll turn it over to Nasser now to.
Sure. There are a few that I'd like us to turn to if we can. Some of them that pick up on Egypt and some of this very rich conversation. There's a question by Nihal, and they have their hand up. So I'm gonna, if I assume it's the same as the one that's in the chat. So I'm gonna call on Nihal, and you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Nasser. Thanks for the panelists for a wonderful discussion. My name is Nihal. I'm a PhD student at the University of Illinois in sociology. I'm in my third year. And my question is related to the conversation on the importance of corporeality and the body in movements and crowds. And it's more of an invitation to comment than a specific questions, but I was thinking about the bodily aftermath. So what happens to the body after the being in a movement or a crowd? So on two levels. So for example of a protester by the name Ahmed Harara, who's was very known in Egypt for losing one of his eyes and wearing an eye patch because he was due to gunfire due to the revolution. So here in this example, the body was forever changed, disabled due to being in this crowd. And on another level, how the body changes effectively. So the body, how it becomes unconsciously perhaps more confident by joining a revolution or a crowd, and that depends from one person to the other, or unconsciously kind of collapses and fears when they face authority or confrontation in the future. So then, like, how do these changes affect these bodies' decisions in the future when it comes to joining a crowd or a mob or a movement? Yeah, that's my question and comment. Thank you so much.
Can I ask whether you have
a thought myself?
Yes, about that question.
So I'm Egyptian, and I was in Egypt during the revolution, and I think people, I can't really speak on behalf of people so much, right? But people I know in my circle, I think we are terrified to do anything else because of what happened in the revolution, not just the violence, but all the repercussions that came after that, all of the, let's say, economic crackdown and crackdown on free speech, which we know as a generation that this is a direct target on what happened during the revolution, right? Like Sisi, the president of Egypt now, like he just recently made a very kind of direct comment. He was one of his talks and speeches or whatever, saying something about, oh, you want to go, basically ridiculing the youth for going on movements and revolutions and saying something direct about the revolution of 2011 instead of like working hard or something like that. So it's very clear that all this like crackdown on free speech, whether it's artistic or the crackdown on women on TikTok and so many other things, it's a target on this generation forever dissenting. So my answer is, in the Egyptian context, a lot of people who were not necessarily in political organizations, I think, are terrified to ever like protest again in any way. Yeah, so that's, thank you.
Nadia, did you want to say anything?
I mean, you know, in some ways, Nihal said it herself, it's difficult to speak on behalf of people, and I really welcome, I think it's a very important point you're raising, something that we, you know, should think about. I guess my only sort of follow up from what you were saying, Nihal, is that I could imagine that it would depend a bit what happens after the event. So, okay, as you say, you know, a body is injured, disabled for life. You know, we are affected by the fear or the trauma for life. But I can just imagine that if the situation would have gone differently in Egypt following the protests, that then the meaning you attach to both the physical injuries, but also what the feelings you experienced would transform. But now, of course, we always see the past in light of the present. And given the present, I mean, I can only imagine how, in some ways, the wounds hurt so much more.
And I would just add that if you think about, like, for example, the Palestinian context where you never seem to win, that the importance of an explanatory frame and the importance of politically continuing to build one, even if it's not about going out onto the street and putting yourself in front of a hail of bullets, but that's very important. And that's some of, I think, what both Nadia and I were referring to, and in a way, what Gayatri was referring to when she was mentioning Saida Hartman's, her analysis of early 20th century New York and Philadelphia, African-American women, kind of how actually one lives their lives and how you do that kind of analysis. So that analysis isn't like really well done in a demonstration, and especially if you're afraid, and you have every reason to be afraid. But I do think the intensity of an experience like that, either you experiencing it or watching it, it cannot be underestimated. I mean, I remember things like that I saw when I was 20, and so they're devastating, but it really helps to be able to turn to people who are active, have not given up on creating the kind of meaning frames and the analysis that helps you figure that out.
So I just want to thank you all for that. There are a few more questions, and I'm going to try, in the interest of time, just to group a few together, and you can sort of pick and choose what to answer. There's a question by James Ivy, which sort of builds on that last point by Francis about the kind of watcher, right? And this distinction between participating in a crowd and sort of viewing or seeing the crowd. And they ask, how do we deal with the question of the onlooker or the people who do not participate in the crowd but merely observe? It seems that the state and the elite have a large amount of power to shape the ways in which non-participants view the crowd. Is this something that mobilizers should challenge and dispute? How does the crowd react to this onlooker's judgment and the kind of, the non-participation, but not exactly the absence of everyone else? So that's one question I wanted to flag. There is a question by Yanis which goes back to the discussion that Gayatri raised about this sort of how we might think these moments of transition between what we call the mob and the crowd. Is there an intelligence difference, they ask, between mob and crowd? Is the crowd a sort of intelligent form versus a kind of activistic, visceral, behavioral mode of the mob? Maybe this relates to questions of organization, inheritance, sort of political tradition, I think, is sort of raised when the specter of January 6th was posed in the discussion. So those are two questions. We have a couple more in the chat that I haven't gone to. Maybe I'll just amend one more, add one more question to that last one so that there are three, and then we can, if there's time, try to digest a few more. Which is, to add to the discussion of, just this is merely a kind of observational point on my behalf, but to add to the discussion about the sort of temporality of crowds, and its relationship to difference, is there a sense, in certain contexts at least, if we try to talk about a sort of contextual approach, is there a sense that the question of difference in certain moments of crowd politics is being approached and apprehended and dealt with differently? And I pose this because one of the striking things for me in the wave of protests and uprising in this country, less than a year ago, was how much a certain apprehension and a certain recognition of difference was present and mobilized and negotiated in a certain way. So it was different, at least in my experience, to a sort of romantic sense that the crowd is this flattening, maybe I don't know how much that's a kind of leftist romanticism, but that the crowd is this, flattening moment and divides. And instead there was this, in fact, active mobilization of difference, right? You can see it in the way uneasy, but maybe effective, way white allies were asked to sort of go to the sides and go to the front. You also saw it in a much more, I think, dramatic way in Portland, and the whole situation about, you know, the Portland mothers putting their, which were majority white middle class women, putting their bodies on the line to stop police violence. So I wonder if there are, you know, ways we might parse in specific contexts a kind of change in the relationship among, you know, organized mobilizations, a change in the relationship to difference. So I'll let you think about those, and we can try to, if there's time, maybe, I know there are more questions coming in.
Can I, I'll just do a quick, just took some notes while you were speaking. So I think, I mean, the onlooker, non-participant, you have to have a kind of more nuanced analysis that just recognizes the complexity of the social world. A lot of the onlookers, non-participants, are kind of busy making a living or just dealing with very, you know, consuming kinds of daily labor that probably often has to do with caretaking. But I think that doesn't mean that onlooker that onlooker is not thinking and is not a potentiality for different kinds of mobilizations and different kinds of explanations. So, but of course, the state and elites, you know, the media are all, you know, kind of captured media is always ready for various kinds of explanations. And one of those explanations that has a lot of influence, and certainly in Egypt and in the Middle East, is the conspiracy theory. I mean, it's absolutely powerful. And the problem is there are so many conspiracies. And so, but, you know, I'm related to a lot of people who are working class and kind of cynical about they're onlookers for cynicism, that they're not really sure that that any of this is going to work, right? So I think there are different reasons why why the majority are onlookers, non-participants, and others just have clear ideological and class interests in being in not participating. So anyway, that's how I would kind of break that down. I don't have a lot of answers, but.
Maybe just to add, I absolutely agree with Francis. We have, of course, and again, temporality comes in here. We have onlookers who become active participants and vice versa. And I guess the question again for me would be looking on to what exactly? So when taking Egypt again as an example, lots of previous onlookers got mobilized in the context of gender-based violence that became very public. And so many women, but also men, started to actually go out. And I guess the question for me, and again, I'm sort of going back to my past growing up in Germany, at some point, onlooking could mean becoming complicit in the violence, in the authoritarianism, in the repression. So there is, you know, I guess the question is, what are you looking at? What are you not participating in? In terms of Janis's question around this, you know, the distinction between mob and crowd. I mean, I guess in some ways, I would say it's sort of similar to this saying, you know, someone's terrorist is someone's freedom fighter. We who share, I mean, those of us who share a certain kind of politics will probably be quite confidently say, okay, this is a crowd and this is a mob. But I assume, you know, those who don't share our politics would think of some of our crowds as mobs and vice versa. So I think, you know, the kind of political positioning is really important. As for Nasser's question around temporality and the question, you know, at which point do crowds maybe deal differently with difference? I mean, again, I will give an example in terms of gendered differences. And I think that when I think, for example, to the more recent uprisings in Iraq and in Lebanon, where actually women were able to break, they didn't, and I mean, one of the persons in the chat said it, I mean, gender differences, gender inequalities will persist, but there was sort of this space to challenge them. And I think there was a space to challenge them because the state, the authoritarian state, is very much perceived to be a proponent of these gendered differences. So I think at some point, again, when the sort of bigger goal might entice people to get on board with some of these gendered claims, because you know the state or however you are sort of protesting against is so clearly reproducing a certain form of a gender regime.
Well, thank you all. We are